The morning Ella Rhodes carried her last jar of peach preserves into town, the sky over Harrow Creek, Texas, hung low and bruised as a 3-day-old wound, and she told herself she would not cry, no matter what happened inside that bank. It was the autumn of 1882, and the drought had gone on so long that the creek the town had been named for had shriveled to a muddy trickle that smelled of copper and dust. Cattle ranchers up north were pushing their herds toward better water, and smaller homesteads like Ella's were being swallowed up one by one, the way a slow fire takes dry grass quietly, steadily, without any apology. She had watched her neighbor, old Curtis Webb, load his family's wagon and head toward San Antonio 2 months back, and the look on his face had told her everything she needed to know about what was coming for the rest of them. Ella was 29 years old, and she had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Daniel Rhodes, had been a good man, not a particularly lucky one, but a good one, and he had died of a fever that swept through Harrow Creek the previous summer, taking him and 2 other men from the valley before the doctor from Abilene could even make the ride out. Daniel had left her the homestead, 40 acres of scorched land, a mule named General, a daughter named Clara who had just turned 7, and a debt of $62 to the Harrow Creek savings and loan that had been due for 3 weeks. She had tried everything she could think of. She had taken in sewing for Mrs. Alderman at the dry goods store. She had sold the 2 good hens she had been keeping for their eggs. She had asked Pastor Green if there was any church work that paid, and he had handed her a basket of canned soup with such a sorrowful look on his face that she had nearly wept right there in the churchyard. But $62 was $62, and after all of it, she was still $47 short, with nothing left to sell except the jar she carried now, wrapped in a square of burlap and held against her chest like it was made of something more precious than peaches and sugar and the last of her summer's labor. The preserves were the finest she made. Everyone in the valley said so. She had learned the recipe from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before that, and there was something in the way Ella prepared them, the slow boil, the particular ratio of cane sugar to fruit, the half-spoonful of vanilla she added at the end, that made them unlike any other jar on any other shelf. She had sold them at the market in better years for $1 each, sometimes more. But one jar, even the finest peach preserves in Harrow Creek County, was not going to satisfy Clement Holt at the bank. Clement Holt was not a cruel man in the way that some men were cruel. He did not enjoy it. But he was a precise man, a ledger-end column man, and he believed that sentiment had no place in the mathematics of debt. When Ella walked through the door of the Harrow Creek Savings and Loan and set the jar on his desk with steady hands and explained that it was all she had at present, but that she was good for the rest if he could just give her another 30 days. He looked at the jar for a long moment, and then looked at her with an expression that was not unkind but was absolutely final. "Mrs. Rhodes," he said, "I have extended this note twice already. The board won't allow a 3rd extension without some form of collateral, and I'm afraid a jar of preserves, however fine, does not qualify." He pushed the jar gently back toward her side of the desk. "I'm going to need the $42 by Friday, or I am going to have to begin foreclosure proceedings on the property." She picked up the jar. She said, "I understand," because she had no other words available to her, and she walked back out into the gray October morning feeling hollow all the way to her boots. She was standing on the boardwalk outside the bank, the jar in her hands and the wind pulling at the brim of her bonnet, when she heard a voice behind her say, "Ma'am, are you all right?" She turned. The man standing there was tall, not in the theatrical way of men who knew they were tall and used it, but in the kind of quiet, unassuming way that made it seem like the world had simply arranged itself around him without his asking. He wore a duster the color of creek-bottom clay, worn at the elbows and patched at one cuff, and his hat was a wide-brimmed brown thing that had seen considerable weather. He had dark eyes, the kind that caught light in unexpected ways, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 4 days. He was not handsome in any magazine illustration sense of the word, but there was something in the set of his face, an openness, a steadiness that made Ella want to answer his question honestly instead of the way she usually answered such questions, which was to say she was fine and walk away before anyone noticed she wasn't. She said, "I have had better mornings." He nodded once, as though that was a perfectly sufficient answer. "I'm Roy Vaughn," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "I just rode in from the Caldwell spread up past the ridge." "You look like you could use a cup of coffee, if you don't mind me saying so." Ella looked at him for a moment. She had learned to be careful about men who offered things too easily, but there was nothing slick about Roy Vaughn. He was not performing generosity. He was simply offering it, the way a person offers a chair to someone who looks tired, without ceremony, without expectation. "Ella Rhodes," she said, "and I suppose I could." They went to the small cafe beside the general store, a narrow room with 4 tables, and a wood stove in the corner that Mabel Trent ran mostly out of stubbornness, and an inexhaustible supply of strong coffee. Ella set the jar of preserves on the table between them like a small, embarrassing confession, and Roy looked at it with genuine curiosity rather than pity, which she appreciated more than she could have said. "Peaches?" he asked. "My own, from the trees along the south fence." She paused. "I was trying to use it to settle part of a debt at the bank. It did not go particularly well." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and studied the jar for a moment. "How much is the debt?" She told him, because the question was so matter-of-fact that it didn't feel intrusive. She told him the whole of it, actually. The 40 acres, the note, the drought, Daniel's passing, the 14 months of trying to hold the thing together with needle and thread and goodwill and determination. And she surprised herself by how much she said. She was not a woman who unraveled in front of strangers. But Roy Vaughn listened with the particular quality of attention that made a person feel their words were being taken seriously, and so she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How old are your peach trees?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon, the trees along the south fence, how old are they?" 8 years, I think. Daniel planted them the first spring we were there." "Why?" "Because 8-year peach trees in this soil, if they've held through the drought, are worth something." He turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands. "I've been working cattle runs for the better part of 10 years, Mrs. Rhodes, and the last 2 I spent learning the supply trade, what towns need, what they'll pay for. There's a mercantile in Calder's Bend, 18 miles east, that I know would take your preserves at $2 a jar if the product is what you say it is." "And from what I can see, it is." Ella stared at him. "That's very kind of you to say, but I have perhaps 6 jars left in the cellar. Even at $2 each, that's $12. The bank wants 42 by Friday." "I know it doesn't solve the whole problem," he said simply, "but it's a start, and starts are worth something." He paused. "I'm going to be honest with you because I think you're a woman who prefers honesty to prettiness. I'm between jobs at the moment. The Caldwell run finished 3 days early. I have a wagon, I know the road to Calder's Bend, and I have nothing pressing until the 12th, when I'm due in Fort Stockton for the next cattle drive. If you wanted, I could help you get those 6 jars to market and find out what else might be done about the rest." She looked at him across the small table, the wood stove ticking warmth into the room, and she thought about all the ways this could be a bad idea. She thought about what Mrs. Alderman would say, and Pastor Green, and the various narrow-eyed women of Harrow Creek who counted everything and forgave nothing. She thought about Clara, waiting back at the homestead with General the mule and a breakfast of cold cornbread, counting on her mother to come home with something other than more bad news. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know me." Roy Vaughn looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "But I knew what it was to watch someone try to carry too much alone, and I know what it looks like when they're about to drop it." He lifted his coffee mug. "I'm not asking anything of you, Mrs. Rhodes. I'm just offering what I have, which right now is time and a wagon and some knowledge of the roads." She thought for one more moment. Then she said, "All right, Mr. Vaughn, thank you." They rode back to the homestead together in Roy's wagon. the October light coming in at a slant across the scrubland, and the thin grass that had burned brown at the edges. Ella sat with the jar of peach preserves in her lap and watched the landscape she had looked at every day for 9 years as though she were seeing it through someone else's eyes, and she noticed that it still had a particular austere beauty to it, the gray-green of the mesquite, the far blue of the ridge, the way the light made everything look like it was lit from within for about 20 minutes around mid-morning. Clara was in the yard when they arrived, feeding scraps to General the mule, and she looked up with the wide, immediate wariness of a child who had learned that unfamiliar adults sometimes brought difficult news. Ella climbed down from the wagon and went to her daughter and put a hand on her head. "This is Mr. Vaughn," she said. "He's going to help us for a few days." Clara looked at Roy with 7-year-old directness. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked. Roy stepped down from the wagon and crouched to her level with an ease that suggested he had been around children without condescending to them. "I am," he said, "among other things. Do you have a horse?" "I do. Her name is Delia. She's tied up back at the livery in town right now, but I can bring her out tomorrow if you'd like to meet her." Clara considered this offer with great seriousness. "All right," she said, and went back to feeding General. Ella showed Roy the cellar. It was a dry cellar dug into the side of the small hill behind the house, lined with stone, and it held the remnants of what had once been a well-stocked larder. Now there were 6 jars of peach preserves, 2 jars of pickled beets, a small crock of lard, half a sack of cornmeal, and not much else. Roy stood in the low doorway and looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a job that needs doing, not with dismay, but with the practical attention of someone calculating what is needed and what can be done. "Good preservation," he said, meaning the jars. "These have been sealed right. They'll hold up fine on the road to Calder's Bend." He looked around the cellar once more, then back at her. "I'll take the 6 jars in tomorrow and see what the mercantile will give us. While I'm in Calder's Bend, I'm going to ask around about a few things." "What kinds of things?" He looked at her evenly. "The kind of things that fill cellars," he said. She did not fully understand what he meant. But she let it go, because the light was changing outside and she needed to get Clara fed and the animals tended, and Roy Vaughn helped with both without being asked, without fanfare, and without taking up more space than was his to take. He slept that night in the small barn beside General and the 2 remaining laying hens, wrapped in his own bedroll, and Ella lay awake in the dark house listening to the wind work itself around the eaves and thinking about the $42, and the fact that Friday was 4 days away, and the strange, unsettling, not entirely unpleasant feeling of having another person in the vicinity who seemed genuinely inclined to be useful. Roy left for Calder's Bend before first light the next morning, the 6 jars of preserves packed in straw in the bed of his wagon. Ella spent the morning doing what she did every morning, building the fire, making breakfast from what she had, mending a tear in Clara's dress, checking on the mule, trying not to think too hard about Friday. But the morning felt different with the sound of Roy's wagon recently faded from the yard, the way a room feels different after someone has just left it. Clara was drawing in the dirt near the porch steps with a stick when Ella came out at noon, making what appeared to be a highly ambitious map of some kind. "Mama," Clara said without looking up, "do you think Mr. Vaughn will come back?" Ella sat down on the porch steps. "I expect so," she said. "He left his bedroll in the barn." "Good," said Clara and added another line to her map. "I like him. You spoke 6 words to him." That was enough to know. Ella looked at her daughter for a moment and said nothing, because she could not argue with the logic of it. Roy came back at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and before she could even ask, he climbed down from the wagon and said, $12 for the 6 jars at $2 each, same as I said. He held out the money, 6 bright coins and some paper, and Ella took it with hands that were not entirely steady. "And the mercantile owner, a man named Prout, says he will take every jar you can make between now and November at the same price, and if you can increase production by spring, he'll make it a standing order. Ella stared at the money in her hand. A standing order. He said your peaches are exceptional. His wife tasted the sample I brought and insisted. Roy's mouth curved slightly at one corner. She also asked me to find out if you'd be willing to share the recipe, and I told her that was entirely your business and none of mine. Ella laughed, a real laugh, the first one in what felt like a very long time, and the sound surprised both of them. The recipe goes to my grave, she said. That's what I figured, he said, and that small almost smile appeared again, and she noticed that it made his eyes do something she did not have a precise word for. But $12 was $12, and she still needed 30 more by Friday. Roy seemed to understand the arithmetic without her saying it. He unhitched the wagon and watered the horse and said, conversationally, as though he were discussing the weather, I also stopped at 3 farmsteads on the road back and asked about surplus produce. There's a man named Barker who has more winter squash than he can use, and a woman, Mrs. Folsom, who has honey 6 full combs that she hasn't been able to sell because she has no way to get it to market. And there's a family called the Yarboroughs who have a root cellar full of cured pork that they're willing to trade for credit at the Mercantile in Calder's Bend. Ella stood very still, looking at him. What are you doing? She asked, not unkindly. He looked at her directly. I'm making sure you have enough to offer Clement Holt on Friday, he said. The Barker squash, the Folsom honey, and the Yarborough pork, I know what Pruitt in Calder's Bend will pay for all of it, and if we make the run tomorrow, we can have the full $42 and some over before Thursday noon. You've been planning this. I've been thinking about it, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him in the fading afternoon light. This man she had known for exactly 1 day and 14 hours, who had spent those hours entirely in service of solving a problem that was not his own. She was not a naive woman. She had learned in the course of 14 months alone to be skeptical of generosity that appeared without a price attached. But there was nothing transactional in Roy Vaughn's face, no ledger being kept behind his eyes. He was simply a man who saw something that needed doing and was doing it. Why? She asked again. Not because she had not asked before, but because she still did not have a satisfying answer. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the horizon where the sun was going down in long orange ribbons. My mother, he said eventually, was a woman on her own for most of my childhood. My father left when I was 4. She worked herself half to death trying to hold onto a small piece of land in New Mexico territory, and there was nobody to help her. We lost it when I was 11. He paused. I don't know that I'm doing this for you specifically, Mrs. Rhodes. I think I might be doing it for her, or for the version of her that never had anyone show up when she needed it. He looked back at her. But I can tell you that I'm not doing it for any reason you need to be suspicious of. Ella held his gaze for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard, stirring the dust. Ella, she said. He blinked. I beg your pardon. You've been calling me Mrs. Rhodes for 2 days. My name is Ella. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that small things shift when they settle into place. Ella, he said, and somehow the word sounded different in his voice than it had in her own, and she was aware of that difference in a way she was not prepared to examine just yet. Thank you, Roy, she said, for all of it. The next day they made the circuit of the 3 farms with Roy's wagon, and Ella learned a great deal about Roy Vaughn in the hours they spent on those roads together. She learned that he had started working cattle drives at 15, trailing longhorns from South Texas up through the dust and fury of the Kishom Trail, and that he had done it for 7 years before a bad storm in Kansas had killed 3 of his trail partners and changed something fundamental in his sense of what mattered and what didn't. She learned that he could really read, not just his own name and a few signs, and that he kept a book in his saddlebag, which was unusual enough among cowboys that she asked about it. And he told her it was a collection of essays by a man named Emerson that he had bought from a second-hand dealer in San Antonio for 15 cents, and read so many times the binding was being held together by a strip of rawhide. She told him about growing up in East Tennessee, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had grown the most remarkable kitchen garden in 3 counties, about meeting Daniel Rhodes at a church social in 1872 when she was 19 and he was 22, about following him west because he had such absolute confidence that the land out here would give them everything they needed if they were only willing to work for it. She told him that Daniel had been right about the work. They had both worked harder than she had ever imagined possible, but that the land, in the end, had its own opinions about what it was going to give. "Do you miss him?" Roy asked, and the question was gentle enough that it didn't feel like prying. "Every day," she said honestly, "but not the way I did at first. At first it was like missing an arm, that kind of absence, that specific pain. Now it's more like," she thought about it, "more like missing the person you used to be before something happened, missing the version of your life that was possible before everything changed." Roy nodded slowly. "That's an honest way to put it." "I have found that honesty is more useful than the alternative," she said. "I have found the same thing," he said, and looked at her with those dark eyes, and she looked away at the road ahead because something about that exchange felt like more than small talk, and she was not sure she was ready for that yet. They collected the squash from Barker, the honey from Mrs. Folsom, a cheerful round woman who insisted they stay for biscuits, and sent them off with an extra comb as a gift, and made arrangements with the Yarboroughs for the pork to be delivered directly to Calder's Bend by their eldest son. Roy handled the negotiations with Pruitt at the Mercantile with a quiet, assured practicality that earned visible respect from the older man, and when they left Calder's Bend in the late afternoon, Roy had $31 in his coat pocket plus the 12 Ella already had, which came to $43, one more than she needed. On the road back to the homestead, Ella sat beside Roy in the wagon seat and felt something she had almost forgotten the name of, which was relief. It was not the simple relief of a problem solved. It was deeper than that, the relief of not being alone in the solving of it, of having someone beside her who had looked at the shape of her trouble and said, without hesitation, "I will help you carry this." She did not say any of that out loud, but she thought that he probably understood it anyway. The next morning, Thursday, one day before the bank's deadline, Roy got up before dawn and left in the wagon again. He had said nothing to Ella about where he was going, and she was up and making breakfast when she heard the wagon wheels on the yard, thinking it was him returning. But when she looked out the window, she saw that it was empty, just his horse, Delia, tethered to the post, and the wagon sitting idle. He had not taken his bedroll. He had not taken Delia. He had gone somewhere on foot, which was unusual enough in this country that she stood at the window for a moment with her coffee growing cold and wondered. He came back at 10 o'clock, not on foot after all. He had borrowed a horse from the livery, a big roan gelding, and when he rode into the yard he was followed by something that took Ella a moment to process because it was so unexpected. A wagon. Not his wagon, a second wagon, a larger one, driven by a young man she didn't know. And in the bed of that wagon were crates, many crates, covered in canvas against the morning chill. Roy dismounted and tied the roan to the fence post and came toward her where she stood on the porch, and he looked, she noticed this, slightly uncertain. Not the open, steady assurance she had come to associate with him in the past 2 days, but something more cautious, as though he was not entirely sure how what he was about to show her would be received. "What is all of this?" she asked. "Come and look," he said. The young man driving the second wagon, who introduced himself as Pete, a supply runner from Calder's Bend, helped Roy unload the crates onto the porch. Ella stood and watched, and as each crate was opened her sense of unreality deepened. There were jars, dozens of them, preserved tomatoes, pickled cucumbers, canned corn, dried beans, smoked venison. There were bags of flour and cornmeal. There was a crock of lard that could last through winter. There was a wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. There were potatoes, a full bushel of them. And there were peaches, preserved peaches, yes, but also fresh ones from somewhere that had evidently gotten more rain. A whole flat of them still with some blush in them, late in the season but real. Ella looked at all of it, arranged on her porch in the gray October morning, and then she looked at Roy Vaughn. "Roy," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "What did you do?" "I called in some favors," he said, in the same tone he might have used to say he had taken a short ride. "Prude at the Mercantile, a rancher named Haskell up past the ridge who owed me 3 years of goodwill from a cattle drive where I pulled his herd through a bad river crossing. Pete here, who I helped out of a wheel situation last spring." He paused. "I also spent about $11 of my own money. Don't look at me like that. I have the Fort Stockton pay coming on the 12th and I won't miss it." She was looking at him. She could not help looking at him. The cellar that had been nearly empty was about to be more full than it had been in 2 years, and he had done it in one night quietly without asking her permission or making a performance of it, and all she had done was offer him coffee and a few hours of conversation. "You can't do this," she said. "It's already done," he said. "Roy, that cellar this is." She stopped because her throat had done something inconvenient. She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment and looked away at the mesquite and the dry grass and the far blue ridge, and she breathed in through her nose until she was sure she could speak evenly. "You barely know me," she said. "I know enough," he said quietly. She looked back at him. He was watching her with that openness in his face, no pretense, no performance, just the simple honesty of a man who had done something because he wanted to and was not going to pretend otherwise. "Why?" she asked. And this time she meant it differently than the previous 2 times. He was quiet for a moment. Pete had gone tactfully around to the other side of the wagon to check a wheel that did not need checking. "Because you carried that jar of preserves into that bank like it was the most dignified thing in the world," Roy said. "Because you sat in that cafe and told me the truth about your situation without asking for pity and without pretending it was fine when it wasn't. Because you laughed about the recipe." He paused, and something moved in his expression that was quiet and careful and real. "Because I have been riding from one place to another for 10 years, and I have never once in that time wanted to stay somewhere, and I have wanted to stay here since the first morning." The wind moved through the yard. General the mule made a low sound from the barn. "Roy," she said gently, "you have a drive in Fort Stockton on the 12th. "I know," he said. "And I have a daughter and 40 acres and a debt that I'm still trying to pay off. I know that too. I am not she searched for the right word. I am not a simple situation. I haven't wanted a simple situation in a long time," he said. "Simple situations are fine for men who are just passing through." She looked at him steadily. "And are you just passing through?" He looked back at her just as steadily. "I don't know what I am," he said honestly. "I know that I would like to find out." That was all. He didn't reach for her hand or say anything else dramatic. He just stood there in the October morning light, honest and steady and a little uncertain. And Ella Rhodes, who had learned in 14 months of widowhood that life was shorter and more contingent than anyone ever really believed until they had to, decided that honesty was worth more than caution. "Help me get these crates into the cellar," she said. The smile that came across his face then was not the small, careful, almost smile she had seen before. It was a full one, and it changed the whole arrangement of his features into something that she found, without any particular intention, quite beautiful. They spent the next 2 hours moving the supplies into the cellar, and Clara came out to help and appointed herself the official organizer of the shelves, directing both Ella and Roy with the absolute authority of someone who has found their vocation. And Roy followed her directions without complaint, and with a seriousness of purpose that made Clara glow with satisfaction, and made Ella's chest do something complicated and warm. That evening, for the first time in many months, there was enough food for a real supper. Ella made a proper stew from the potatoes and the smoked venison, and she put biscuits in the Dutch oven, and the three of them sat at the table in the small house with the lantern lit and the fire going, and it felt, this was the thought she allowed herself and then tried to set aside, it felt like something she had been missing without quite knowing she was missing it. Roy told Clara about cattle drives. He described the prairie at night, thousands of longhorns settled in the sky above a full field of stars, and the sounds of the night riders singing to keep the herd calm, and Clara listened with both elbows on the table and her chin in her hands and her eyes round with the seriousness of someone taking in genuinely important information. "Were you ever scared?" Clara asked. "Plenty of times," Roy said. "Of what?" "River crossings, mostly, and storms." "There's nothing like a storm on the open plain, the lightning hitting the ground out in front of you, the herd going skittish." He paused. "And the loneliness of it sometimes. That's a kind of scared, too, when you're a long way from anything familiar and you're not sure you're going the right direction." Clara considered this. "Mama says the right direction is always the one that needs doing," she said. Roy looked across the table at Ella. "Your mama is a smart woman," he said. Ella was looking at her stew when he said it, and she felt the warmth of it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. The next morning, Friday, she went to the bank. She paid Clement Holt $42 and told him, clearly and without any shakiness in her voice, that she expected the note to be marked paid in full. He made the notation in his ledger with the particular satisfaction of a man who has had a confusing week brought to an orderly conclusion, and handed her the stamped receipt with something that might, from a great distance, have looked like a trace of admiration. She walked out of the bank and stood on the boardwalk in the autumn sun and breathed. Roy was waiting outside, leaning against the hitching rail with his arms crossed and his hat pulled down against the light. He looked up when she came out. She held up the receipt. He uncrossed his arms and that full smile appeared. "Good," he said simply. She stood there for a moment, and then she did something she had not planned, which was to close the 3 steps between them and take hold of his hand. He looked down at her hand in his with an expression of quiet, careful wonder, and then he wrapped his fingers around hers, and they stood like that on the boardwalk in Harrow Creek for a moment that was simple and enormous all at once. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "You would have found a way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but this way was better." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I leave for Fort Stockton on the 12th. That's 9 days." "I know," she said. She did not let go of his hand. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "that 9 days is not very long, but I have also been thinking that Fort Stockton to Harrow Creek is about 4 days' ride, and I expect to be finished with the drive by December, and there is no earthly reason I couldn't ride back this direction when it's done." She looked up at him. "You'd come back, if you'd want me to," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the clean autumn light. This man she had known for 4 days who had filled her cellar, and listened to her talk, and made her daughter's eyes go wide with wonder. And she thought about 14 months of carrying everything alone, and what it felt like to set some of it down. "I would want you to," she said. The 9 days that followed were the kind of days that print themselves carefully and permanently in a person's memory, so that years later they can be retrieved whole, not in fragments, not in impression, but fully, the way a letter is retrieved from a drawer. Ella and Roy moved through those 9 days with the particular consciousness of people who know they are running out of time and have decided to use it honestly rather than carefully. He rode Delia out to the homestead every morning and stayed through the afternoon, and they worked alongside each other with the natural ease of people whose rhythms happened to match. He repaired the barn door that had been sticking since spring, replaced 2 boards in the porch floor that had gone soft with moisture, helped her dig up and store the last of the kitchen garden for winter, and spent an entire afternoon teaching Clara how to properly tie a half-hitch knot with a length of rope, at Clara's insistence and with Roy's complete and patient cooperation. But they also talked. They talked the way people talk when time is limited, and they have decided honesty is worth more than impression management about what mattered to them, about what they were afraid of, about the kinds of lives they had wanted when they were young, and how those lives had bent under the weight of actual living. Roy told her about the loneliness of the trail in a way he said he had never told anyone, because most men he rode with would have found it soft, and she told him about the night Daniel had died, the specific, terrible night of it in a way she had never been able to tell anyone else, because everyone else had needed her to be managing well. They sat on the porch in the evenings when Clara was asleep, the stars coming out over the ridge in numbers that seemed impossible, and they talked and sometimes fell into comfortable silences that were their own kind of conversation. And Ella began to understand what it meant to know someone, not just to learn their history, but to feel the actual shape of them, the way you feel the shape of a room when you have lived in it long enough. On the 8th evening, he reached across the porch bench and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face, and the gesture was so careful and so tender that she went absolutely still for a moment, the way a person goes still when they have heard something surprising and beautiful. "I didn't mean to presume," he said immediately, and began to pull his hand back. She caught his hand with hers. "You didn't," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the night was very large and very quiet around them, and he leaned forward slowly and she leaned toward him and he kissed her. Not urgently, not as though he were claiming something, but gently, with a kind of care that felt like the most honest thing she had experienced in a very long time. When they drew back, the stars were still there, and the wind was still moving through the mesquite, and she was aware of his hand still holding hers. "I will come back in December," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be here." He left on the 12th as planned. Clara woke up early to say goodbye and stood in the yard with her arms crossed and her chin up in the precise way she held herself when she was trying not to be sad. And Roy crouched down and said something quietly to her that Ella couldn't hear, and Clara nodded seriously and went back inside. Then Roy stood and looked at Ella, and the morning was cold and gray, and the sky was the color of pewter. He kissed her once more briefly in the yard, and then he swung up onto Delia and touched the brim of his hat and rode south, and Ella watched him go until he was a small shape against the gray horizon, and then nothing at all. Clara came back out of the house and stood beside her. "He said he'd bring me a real lasso from Fort Stockton," Clara said. "Did he?" "He also said he was coming back in December." Clara looked up at her. "Is he?" "He is," Ella said. Clara nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said, and went a feed general. November arrived and the weather sharpened. Ella was busy, genuinely busy, in a way that was different from the desperate busyness of the previous year. She spent 3 days a week making preserves from the fruit Roy had brought and from her own trees, and she discovered that her peach trees had survived the drought with a kind of stubborn vitality that seemed personal, like a small act of defiance by the land. The Calder's Bend Mercantile took everything she produced, and Prout wrote her a note in the 3rd week of November saying he had 3 other establishments in the county asking for her preserves by name, and could she discuss an expanded arrangement in the new year. She wrote to him saying yes. She wrote it in the good handwriting her father had taught her, with the ink her mother had given her, sitting at the kitchen table by the lantern, and she felt something she recognized after a moment's searching as a future. Not the future she had planned, not the one she had imagined when she and Daniel were young and certain, and the land seemed limitless, but a real one with actual contours that she was building herself, jar by jar and acre by acre. She thought about Roy every day. She tried not to make a discipline of it, but he was there, in the mornings when she was making the fire, in the evenings when she sat on the porch. In the particular way the light hit the ridge at noon that she had noticed because he had noticed it first. She had his handwriting in her head because he had left her a note on the morning he departed, just a few lines, tucked under the coffee pot, that said, "I will think of you at every river crossing." That seemed like enough to live on for a while. The weeks accumulated. She fixed the things she could fix and waited on the things she couldn't. She paid December's note at the bank on time, with money she had earned herself, and when Clement Holt stamped the receipt, she allowed herself a small, private satisfaction that she thought Daniel would have found amusing. She was in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in the 1st week of December, kneading bread dough with Clara sitting across the table drawing pictures of horses in increasingly elaborate variety, when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. She knew, before she even looked up, that it was him. She knew by the rhythm of it, or possibly by something less explicable than that. She went to the window. Roy Vaughn was riding Delia across the yard in the cold December morning, and he looked exactly as he had when he had left, the clay-colored duster, the wide-brimmed hat, the dark eyes scanning the property with that particular attention of a man arriving somewhere he is glad to be arriving. Tied to Delia's saddle horn was a coiled length of good rope, a proper lasso, braided and smooth. Clara had already pushed back from the table and run to the door. Ella followed more slowly, drying her hands on her apron, and she stepped out onto the porch as Roy dismounted, and when he turned and saw her standing there, the expression that came over his face was the kind that a person cannot manufacture or perform. It was simply there, fully and completely, like a door opening into a lit room. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. Clara had already descended on him, demanding the lasso with the directness of someone who has been exercising patience for 6 weeks and considers the obligation discharged. Roy handed it to her with great ceremony and showed her how to swing it, and for the next 20 minutes the yard was full of the sound of Clara attempting to rope General, who regarded the whole enterprise with the philosophical patience of a very old mule who has seen many things. Ella stood on the porch and watched, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a life expands instead of contracts. She had forgotten what that looked like. Roy stayed for supper. He had brought things, not a whole wagon load this time, but thoughtful things. A good cut of beef he had gotten from the stockyard in Fort Stockton, a small sack of sugar, a paper packet of real coffee, and a wrapped parcel that turned out to be a small illustrated book of birds that he set on the table in front of Clara without comment, and watched her open with an expression of such complete and unguarded delight that Ella had to look away. After supper, after Clara was in bed, they sat by the fire, and Roy told her about Fort Stockton, the drive, the men, the difficult river crossing near the end that had gone exactly as well as such things go when every man does his job without panic. He told her about thinking of her during it, which he said without any self-consciousness, and she told him about November, about the Calder's Bend Mercantile, about Prout's letter and the possibility of an expanded arrangement. Roy listened to all of it with the focused attention she had come to understand was simply how he listened, not performing interest but actually having it, and when she was done he said, "You've built something real here." "I'm trying," she said. "No," he said. "You have. The trying is over, it's real." She looked at him across the firelight. He had taken off his hat and his hair was dark and slightly disordered from the ride, and the fire made his eyes warmer than their usual quality, and she thought that she had spent 31 years on this earth making rational decisions for reasonable reasons, and that for once she would like to make an irrational one. "Roy," she said. "Ella, how long can you stay?" He looked at her steadily. "There's a rancher in New Mexico territory who wants a drive crew by February. That's about 2 months. 2 months, she repeated. "But," he said and stopped. "But." He was quiet for a moment, working something through in the way he did, methodical, honest, not reaching for words he didn't mean. "I have been riding drives for 10 years, he said, "and every time one of them ends I pack my bedroll and go find the next one. I have never owned a piece of land, I have never had more than what fits in 2 saddlebags, and I have never particularly thought about changing that." He paused. "Until now." She waited. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like more than I mean or less than I mean," he said, "so I am just going to say it plainly. I would like to stay. Not for 2 months. I would like to stay and help you build what you're building here, and I would like to do that in whatever arrangement seems right and decent and honest to both of us." He met her eyes. "I am asking you, Ella, not assuming. Asking." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the December dark, and the stars above Harrow Creek were brilliant and unreachable and indifferent. She thought about the 14 months. She thought about the jar of preserves she had carried to the bank. She thought about the cellar full of provisions he had left on her porch before the week was out, and the note under the coffee pot, and the lasso for Clara, and the way he had crouched down to Clara's level on the very first day and taken her question seriously. She thought about kissing him on the porch with the stars overhead and the feeling of his hand on hers. "Stay," she said. It was a simple word, and it contained everything. He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, and they sat by the fire for a long time in the December night, and it was not a dramatic moment or a cinematic one. It was just true, which is its own kind of grandeur. December moved through its days with a quiet warmth that the cold air made no impression on. Roy moved from the barn into the house, into the spare room that had once been a storage room, repurposed with the wooden cot he built himself from timber he cut, and planed with a competence that Ella watched with something between admiration and amusement. He did not presume more than what was offered, and she appreciated the care of it, the way he respected the pace of things rather than trying to accelerate them. But the days were full in every good way. He was up before her most mornings, the fire already built by the time she came out of her room, the coffee on. He and Clara had developed an entire parallel world of communication that seemed to involve signal systems and running jokes, and an ongoing argument about whether General was smarter than a dog, a debate Clara was firmly on the affirmative side of. He helped her expand the preserving operation. He had gotten, from Prout and from some inquiry around the county, a second large canning pot and additional jars, and he set up a proper workstation in the kitchen that doubled her throughput in a single afternoon. He also, quietly and without announcement, began repairing the south fence. The fence had been deteriorating for 2 years, post by post, rail by rail, and Ella had been managing around the worst sections, with improvised wire patches that Daniel had taught her to do, and that Roy regarded with a kind of respectful acknowledgement of ingenuity before replacing them with proper work. He spent a week on the fence, sun-up to mid-afternoon, and by the end of it the south perimeter of the 40 acres was sounder than it had been since the first year they'd built it. "You didn't have to do that," she told him. "I know," he said, which was by now his standard response to such statements. Mrs. Alderman from the dry goods store came to call one afternoon with barely concealed curiosity and left apparently satisfied, if not entirely without commentary. Pastor Green stopped by the following Sunday with the transparent pretext of checking on the congregation's well-being, and spent 20 minutes in theological conversation with Roy that seemed to genuinely surprise and impress him. Roy had opinions about theology that were thoughtful and heterodox and expressed with such courtesy and self-possession that the pastor left looking both challenged and pleased. "You surprised him," Ella told Roy afterward. "I surprised myself a little," Roy said. "I haven't talked like that in a while." "You should do it more," she said. "You're good at it." He looked at her with that quiet quality she had come to love. "You're good at seeing things in people," he said. "I am good at seeing things in you," she said, and then was briefly startled by her own directness, but he only smiled the full smile, the one that changed everything, and she decided directness was entirely the right policy. Christmas came, quiet and cold and good. Ella made a proper Christmas dinner with the provisions that were now, genuinely, abundant in the cellar: roast pork and potato gratin, and preserved green beans from the summer, and a pie made from the peaches she had kept specifically for this, and a small pudding sweetened with honey from Mrs. Folsom's combs. Clara received a new dress that Ella had been sewing in secret, and a set of colored pencils that Roy had ordered through the Calder's Bend Mercantile in November, and which Clara received with the specific speechless reverence of a child who has been given the exact right thing. After dinner, while Clara was deeply occupied with the colored pencils at the kitchen table, Roy and Ella sat on the porch in the cold. She had her wool shawl, he had his coat, and looked out at the gray winter sky over the valley. The creek was nearly dry again, but there were birds in the mesquite, small and brown and industrious, and the ridge in the distance had a bluish cast it got in winter that was its own kind of beauty. "This is a good life," Roy said, and it was not a wistful thing or a comparative one. It was simply an observation. "It is," she agreed. "It is now." He turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and they were both very still for a moment. "Ella," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't know what I was going to say." "Yes, I do," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right, tell me." "You were going to say something about the future," she said carefully. "About what we are doing here and what it means and whether there is a name for it." He was quiet. "And the answer," she said, "is that there should be. There should be a name for it." He reached into his coat pocket, and what he brought out was small, a ring, simple and unadorned, silver, the kind that was made by a jeweler in Calder's Bend who worked in a back room off the main street and did quiet, careful work without flourish. He had not gone to Calder's Bend recently. He must have gotten it before, in November, or even before that, when the possibility of this was still just a thing he was working through. She looked at it in his palm. "I bought it in November," he said, confirming the thought. "I didn't know when to give it to you. I didn't want to rush anything or presume anything." He looked at her directly. "I am asking, Ella, not assuming like before." She looked at the ring and then at him, and she thought about the morning she had walked into that bank with a jar of peach preserves and walked back out into a morning that seemed entirely closed, and how 5 days later her cellar was full, and there was a man at her table who looked at her the way Roy Vaughn looked at her. And she thought that life was stranger and more generous than anyone ever expected it to be when they were in the middle of the hard parts. "Yes," she said. "Roy, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and it fit, because he had asked Mrs. Folsom to ask around discreetly, which she had clearly done, and the thought of that, the care of that, the quiet, thorough effort of it, made her eyes do something she was going to refuse to call weeping, but that Roy pretended not to notice with great tact. Then he kissed her, properly this time, in the cold December air on the porch of her house, with the birds in the mesquite and the ridge in the distance, and the life they were building together stretching out ahead of them. And it was everything the moment needed to be. Clara appeared in the doorway approximately 2 minutes later, holding a colored pencil drawing of a horse. She looked at them. She looked at her mother's hand. She looked at Roy. "Finally," she said, with the authority of someone who has been waiting for the adults around her to catch up for some time, and went back inside. Roy made a sound that was almost a laugh. Ella buried her face in his shoulder and let herself laugh fully, and his arms came around her, and the winter sky overhead was wide and cold and completely beautiful. They were married in February, at the Harrow Creek church, on a Saturday morning, with a thin sun making what it could of the winter light. It was not a large wedding. Ella had no family within riding distance, and Roy's nearest kin were a cousin in New Mexico and an aunt in Austin who sent a warm letter by post, but Harrow Creek showed up, because small towns generally do for occasions like this, and because Ella Rhodes was known and liked, and because Roy Vaughn had spent 4 months quietly and competently becoming part of the fabric of the place in a way that people noticed and approved of without always having words for it. Mrs. Folsom cried. Clement Holt from the bank attended and shook Roy's hand with something approaching genuine warmth, which surprised everyone, including Clement Holt. Pete, the supply runner from Calder's Bend, came and brought his wife and stood in the back grinning. Even Mrs. Alderman, who had been carefully noncommittal on the subject of Roy Vaughn for months, admitted to the woman standing next to her that he seemed steady, which was the highest compliment Mrs. Alderman dispensed. Clara stood beside her mother in a new dress and held General's lead rope. General was not inside the church, but was tied outside the door because Clara had insisted he be included in some capacity. And when Pastor Green asked if anyone had any objection to this union and there was the customary silence, Clara said, quietly but audibly, "No objections," which produced a ripple of laughter that broke the last of the formality and made the whole room easy. Roy and Ella looked at each other during that laughter with the particular look of two people who are completely in it together, and it was better than any vow. Afterward there was food in the church hall. The community had organized it, the way small communities organize such things, with the cheerful efficiency of people who have strong opinions about casseroles and pies. And Roy and Ella moved through the afternoon in that particular state of quiet and radiant happiness that is the specific weather of a wedding day when you have actually meant every word of it. Spring came in the way spring comes to that part of Texas, fast and extravagant, the scrubland going green almost overnight, the mesquite flowering, the creek running again with the March rains that came late but came. Ella's peach trees flowered for the first time in 2 years with genuine conviction, white blossoms so thick on the branches that Clara declared it was snowing from the inside out, and Roy laughed at that, and then stood for a long time looking at the trees with a particular expression that Ella recognized as the one he wore when something moved him, and he was choosing not to make a production of it. The preserving business was, by spring, a genuine concern. Prout had formalized the arrangement in January, and 2 additional mercantiles in 2 towns had followed suit by March. Ella had written to her mother's sister in Tennessee asking for 2 additional family recipes, a strawberry preserve and a plum jam she remembered from childhood, and had received in return a long letter with 3 recipes and the kind of enthusiastic written approval of her new situation that was almost better than having been there in person. Roy had built her a proper preserving kitchen in what had been a lean-to off the back of the house, a real room, with shelving and counter space and a second stove specifically for canning. And she stood in it on the morning it was finished and felt a pride in her own work that was as clean and good as anything she had ever felt. Roy continued to be exactly who he had been from the start, which is the rarest and most valuable thing about a person: consistent. He was up early, he worked hard, he was patient with Clara and honest with Ella and direct with people he dealt with in business, and capable of sitting in silence when silence was what was needed. He had decided in February that he was done with cattle drives. Or rather, he had decided it the way a person decides something they have already known for a while, in the quiet of a winter morning with a fire going, and the woman he loved across the kitchen table and no particular desire to be anywhere else on earth. He had written to the Fort Stockton rancher and declined the February drive, and to the New Mexico outfit and declined that one too, and had felt nothing afterward except the solid satisfaction of a decision made. He was building the homestead instead. He knew things about land, about water, about what this particular soil could grow if it was managed right, that he had accumulated across 10 years of being in and out of ranches across the territory, and he applied that knowledge now with the same quiet thoroughness he applied to everything. He convinced Ella to let him try a small vegetable plot in the east field that had always been considered too dry, using a technique of shallow irrigation channels he had seen used successfully up near the Red River. By June, it was producing. There was one afternoon in April when Roy rode into Harrow Creek to pick up some supplies from the general store, and encountered 2 men outside the saloon who had the particular look of men who spent their time being unpleasant in ways that were just barely below the actionable threshold. One of them made a remark about Roy's business, suggesting in a loose and threatening way that the preserve's operation was drawing more attention from outside the county than might be comfortable for some parties who had preferred the Rhodes homestead to quietly fail and become available for acquisition. Roy came home from town that afternoon and told Ella about it plainly, without dramatization, but without omission. He named the men, Elias Cross and a man called Doyle, and said that Cross had been making moves on failed homesteads in the county for 2 years, acquiring them through the bank when debts went unpaid, and that he had likely had an interest in the Rhodes property falling to Clement Holt. Ella absorbed this information with the particular stillness she used for things that required thought rather than reaction. "What do we do?" she asked. "We do what we're already doing," Roy said. "We pay our notes, we produce, we build. Men like Cross work on the margin of other people's failure. We don't give him any margin to work on." He paused. I also spoke to Clement Holt today since I was in there for the supplies, just a conversation. Just letting him know the homestead is doing well and we expect it to continue to do well." He looked at her. "Holt is not a bad man, he's a precise man, and precise men respond to demonstrated numbers." She looked at him. "You're good at this," she said. "At what?" "At knowing which kind of fight is worth fighting and how to fight it," she said. "Daniel was brave, but he was a frontal person. He would have gone into that saloon and confronted Cross directly, and it would have gone badly." She was not saying it critically, she said it with the honest clarity of a person who understood her first husband's nature. "You think around things." "I had a long time to learn it," Roy said. "On the trail, the straight-ahead approach gets people hurt more often than not. You learn to read the terrain." Cross and Doyle were not heard from again, or not in any way that landed on the Rhodes Vaughn homestead. The preserves business continued to grow. The peach trees produced in abundance that summer, and the new vegetable plot did well enough that Roy put in a second section in the fall. Ella wrote a letter to Prout in Calder's Bend, confirming the standing order through the following spring, and received in return a letter with flattering language about the quality of her product and an inquiry about whether she might be interested in the strawberry preserves as well. She wrote back saying yes, and she taught herself the recipe from her aunt's letter, making 3 experimental batches before the 4th one was right, and it was excellent, deep red and bright, with the particular flavor intensity that comes from slow cooking and patience. In the late summer, Ella began to understand that she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for several days before she told Roy, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted to understand her own feelings about it first, and her feelings were complicated in the way that complicated things are. Joy, yes, and a kind of soft, expanding wonder, but also the fear that runs alongside joy for people who have lost before, who know how contingent everything is. She had lost Daniel. She was aware, as she had not been at 19, that things could be taken. She told Roy on a September evening on the porch, with the end-of-summer heat finally breaking and the stars coming out in their usual profusion. She said it simply, directly, and watched his face. What came over his face in that moment was something she had not seen there before, and she had learned his face well. It was something open and young, a kind of wonder that seemed to make him 20 years old for a moment, stripped of the weathering and the composed steadiness, just raw and astonished and glad. He reached for her hands and held them carefully, as though she were something fragile, and then seemed to realize that was incorrect because she was Ella Rhodes, Ella Vaughn now, who had carried 40 acres alone for 14 months, and he held them instead the way you hold something you are simply glad to be holding. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm frightened," she said honestly, "and I'm glad, both at once." "Yes, that sounds right," he said. "That sounds exactly right." He was so careful with her in the months that followed, not smothering, not anxious in a way that would have been exhausting, but attentive in the particular way that says, "I am paying attention because you matter, not because I am afraid." He took over the heavier work in the preserving kitchen without comment. He made sure the wood stove in the bedroom was always warm. He read to her in the evenings, from the Emerson book with the rawhide binding, and from 2 other books he had gotten from a traveling bookseller who came through Harrow Creek in October. One a collection of poetry, and one a natural history of the Texas Hill Country that he claimed was for practical purposes, but that she suspected he found genuinely fascinating. Clara was thrilled about the baby in the practical, project-oriented way that was entirely characteristic of her. She decided immediately that there would be a brother, assigned him a name Thomas, after a boy she admired at school, and began drawing pictures of him in the colored pencil book with the confidence of someone for whom the outcome was already decided. "And if it's a girl?" Ella asked. Clara considered this briefly. "Then I'll teach her to rope," she said. Ella laughed so hard that Roy came in from the barn to see what had happened, and when she told him, he sat down at the kitchen table and covered his face with his hand in a manner that might have been amusement or might have been something more. The winter was mild, as Texas winters sometimes are, cold enough to need fires but without the bone-deep freeze that some years brought. The valley looked different to Ella now than it had a year ago or 2 years ago. The same scrubland and ridge and dried grass, the same pewter sky in January, but weighted differently in her perception. She had been ready to lose it, this land. She had been standing at the edge of that loss with a jar of peach preserves in her hands. And now there was a full cellar and a repaired south fence and a second stove in the lean-to, and a man who loved her and a child coming. And it was the same 40 acres it had always been, but it was also entirely different. The way a room is different when it is inhabited by people who choose it. She thought sometimes about the specific morning that had begun all of it. The morning she had put the last jar of preserves in the burlap square and walked down to the bank, telling herself she would not cry. She thought about how close it had been. How if Roy had not happened to be standing outside that bank, if he had happened to be passing the other side of the street or had ridden out the previous day, the whole thing would have gone differently. The house would have gone to Holt and then to Cross probably, and she and Clara would have been on a wagon to San Antonio like Curtis Webb, and none of this would exist. She mentioned this to Roy one night in January, and he listened and then said, "I think about that too, about the margins. Does it frighten you?" "It humbles me," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "You are a surprisingly philosophical cowboy, Roy Vaughn. 15 cents worth of Emerson," he said. "It does things to a person." She laughed and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and the fire was warm and the night was cold and everything was exactly what it should be. The baby arrived in March, in the season's first genuinely warm week, attended by the midwife from town, a capable woman named Agnes Tupper, who had delivered half the children in Harrow Creek County, and who regarded the event with the brisk professionalism of someone to whom it was never routine, but always familiar. Roy was not in the room, that was not how it was done, but he was in the house, and he spent 4 hours on the other side of the door being as steady as he could manage, which Clara later reported, with some scorn, was not very steady at all. The baby was a boy. Roy came in when Agnes Tupper opened the door, and Ella was sitting up against the pillows with the baby in the crook of her arm, and when Roy sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms, he held him the way he held things he was glad of, carefully, fully present, nothing managed or calculated. "Thomas," Clara said immediately, from the doorway where she was leaning with her arms crossed and a triumphant expression. Roy looked up at Ella. Ella looked at the baby. "Thomas," she said, "if that's all right with you." "Thomas," Roy said and looked at the baby, and whatever was in his face right then was entirely his own and entirely sufficient. Thomas Roy Vaughn. They settled on the middle name without a formal discussion, in the way that some decisions make themselves when the moment is right. The spring that year was the best they had seen. The rains came at the right time and the creek ran clear and the peach trees were magnificent. Roy stood under them one April morning and said, simply, "Daniel planted these." And Ella, standing beside him, said, "Yes, he did." And there was a moment of acknowledgement that did not need to be anything more than what it was. The preserves business by that spring had become something Ella had not quite anticipated when she stood in Clement Holt's office with a jar of peaches and a $42 debt. It had become sustaining. Not wealthy sustaining. They were not wealthy, and the homestead was still a working operation that required constant labor, but genuinely, practically sustaining in a way that meant the note was paid. The cellar was full, the children were fed, and there was enough left over each month to add slowly to a small account at the Harrow Creek savings and loan that now had Ella's name on it rather than a debt. Clement Holt had, at some point in the preceding year, made the internal ledger adjustment from the Rhodes mortgage to the Vaughn account, and when Roy and Ella came in to make a deposit in April, he shook both their hands with what was now clearly unambiguous goodwill. The world of Harrow Creek had shifted in small ways that mattered. Roy was a known man now, not an unknown one, and the homestead was a known enterprise, and both of those things provided a kind of security that was distinct from but as real as the financial kind. They heard that spring that Elia's Cross had run into significant trouble with a land deal in the next county, something to do with a disputed title that had not been adequately checked, a mistake that precise men like Clement Holt did not make, and that men like Cross were eventually undone by. The resolution was quiet and legal and resulted in Cross's departure from the county, and Roy heard about it from Pete on one of the supply runs and came home and told Ella and said nothing further on the subject, which was exactly the right amount to say. Summer came blazing and full. Thomas was 3 months old and vigorous, with Roy's dark eyes and Ella's determined expression, and Clara had appointed herself his primary educator in matters of livestock and rope work, which was premature but completely characteristic. General, the mule was showing his age but was still functional, and regarded the new baby with the philosophical resignation he applied to everything. Roy bought in June, with the money he had been setting aside from the modest income of the homestead, and from a single 2-week cattle consultation he had done in May for a neighboring rancher, not a drive, just advice on a difficult herd situation, a modest piece of adjoining land. 8 acres. It shared the southern fence and held a good spring and some established oak that would give shade and fuel. He came home from Harrow Creek with the deed and put it on the kitchen table and said, "I know we didn't discuss it. If you think it was wrong of me to decide without talking it through, Roy," she said. "Yes. Sit down and have some coffee," she said, "and tell me about the spring." He sat down, and she poured the coffee, and he described the spring and what it would mean for the dry season, and she listened and asked good questions, and they spent the next hour planning what could be done with 8 additional acres in a way that was one of the most contented hours of either of their lives, without either of them saying so in those terms. The homestead now was genuinely a farm in a way that it had aspired to be under Daniel and had not quite managed, not because of any failure of Daniel's intention, but because things had been harder than expected and the drought had been severe, and one man could only do so much. Under Roy and Ella together, with the preserve's income and the expanded land and the irrigation channels in the east field and the good spring in the new 8 acres, it was becoming what it had always had the potential to be. Years later, when people asked Ella Vaughn about how the place had come to be what it was, she said it simply. She had carried a jar of preserves to the bank in October of 1882, and a cowboy had seen her standing outside it, and the rest had been a matter of showing up every day and doing the work with someone beside you who believed in what you were doing. She did not say that it had also been the particular quality of Roy Vaughn's attention from the first moment, or that the cellar full of provisions he had left on her porch before the first week was out had told her more about his character than a year of careful observation could have. She let people draw their own conclusions about the specifics. Roy, when asked the same question, said, "I wanted to stay, and I was lucky enough to be wanted." Thomas was walking by the following spring, which Clara accepted as sufficient development to begin his lasso education. Roy built a fence in the yard at a safe height, and Clara demonstrated her technique with great patience, and Thomas fell down repeatedly and laughed, and Roy sat on the porch watching them, and Ella stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder, and the April light was the clearest light she had ever seen. She was expecting again by May, which she told Roy one morning in the kitchen, and he looked up from his coffee with the same astonished, unguarded gladness that had crossed his face the first time, as though it were still surprising and wonderful, which it was. "Thomas will have to share General," Clara said, when informed. "Thomas already shares General," Roy said. "He'll have to share more," Clara said, with the authority of someone who has been the primary general sharer for years and understands the difficulties. The second child was a girl, born the following February, and they named her Me after Ella's mother, and Thomas was 18 months old and regarded her with extreme suspicion for approximately 2 weeks before deciding she was acceptable. Clara, 8 years old by this point, pronounced her beautiful and immediately began planning her education. Roy held Me the first morning and looked at Ella and said, "Thank you," quietly, and it encompassed everything, the homestead and the peach trees and the years and the children and all of it, and she looked back at him and understood exactly what he meant. The homestead was, by 1886, one of the more recognized small producers in the county. Ella's preserves had a reputation that extended to towns she had never visited, carried there by merchants and travelers and word of mouth in the particular way that genuinely good things propagate. She had added the strawberry preserve and the plum jam to the regular line, and Roy had suggested practically, on the basis of market observation, a savory pickle relish that she had developed herself over the course of a summer, and it had become the most popular item she made, which she found both gratifying and faintly irritating because she had spent the most pride on the peaches. The south fence was in excellent repair. The east field produced reliably. The new 8 acres had been planted with a kitchen garden of a scale that would have made Ella's mother weep with joy. The cellar, the same stone-lined cellar that Roy had stood in the doorway of 3 years ago and assessed with quiet practicality, was full in a way that required planning to maintain. Ella thought about that sometimes, about the cellar, about standing in the doorway of it with Roy on the second day she had known him, when it held 6 jars of preserves and not much else, and how he had looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a job that needs doing and said, "Good preservation." As though it were a starting point rather than an ending one, as though he had already seen what it could be. She had not understood then fully what kind of man saw things that way. She understood now. On an October evening in 1886, 4 years from the morning, she had walked to the bank with the jar of peach preserves. Ella and Roy sat on the porch as they often did after the children were in bed, with the stars overhead in their usual indifferent abundance, and the night sounds of the valley moving around them. Thomas was 3.5 and Me was 20 months, and both of them were asleep inside with the reliable completeness of young children who have had full days. Clara, 12 now and increasingly herself in a way that was extraordinary to witness, had gone to bed reading, which was a new habit she had developed with the encouragement of the small library Roy had accumulated over the years. The valley looked, in the October dark, the way it had looked on the morning Ella had driven to town with the burlap-wrapped jar. The same ridge, the same mesquite, the same dry grass smell that was specific to this time of year in this part of Texas that Ella had come to associate entirely with home. "You know what today is," Roy said. She did. "4 years," she said. 4 years since you sat across a cafe table from me and told me the truth about your situation. 4 years since you offered to help a stranger for no particular reason." "I had reasons," he said. "You told me it was your mother." "Partly," he said. She looked at him. "What was the other part?" He was quiet for a moment, as he always was when he was assembling an honest answer rather than a quick one. "You were the most dignified person I had ever seen in a difficult moment," he said. "You had that jar of preserves and you were holding it like it was the last line of your self-respect, and you didn't flinch." He paused. "I wanted to know what happened to a person like that. I wanted to see whether the world was fair enough to give her what she needed." Ella was quiet for a moment. "And was it?" He looked at her with those dark eyes in the porch lantern light, and the full smile came across his face, still the same one, still capable of doing the same thing to the whole arrangement of his features, 4 years on. "It gave her a cowboy with a wagon and $11, he said. "I think it was fair enough." She laughed and he laughed too, and then she took his hand, and they sat in the October night on the porch of the homestead that was genuinely theirs, built into what it was by both of them, year by year, jar by jar, fence post by fence post, acre by acre, and the stars were exactly where they had always been, and the life they had made together was as solid and real and good as anything either of them had ever dared to want. Inside, Clara slept with her book. Thomas slept with his fists curled. Me slept with the perfect abandon of a child who has never had reason to doubt that morning will come and will be good. The peach trees along the south fence, 8 years old when Ella had told Roy about them, were 12 now and in their prime, roots sunk deep enough to find water through any drought this land could produce. They would go on for decades. The preserves they made would be known in towns Ella had never visited and wouldn't visit, carried by merchants along roads she had never traveled, feeding people she would never meet. A standing order, a real thing. Roy squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad," she said. "Completely and without condition, I am glad." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, a gesture so quiet and full of feeling that it needed no addition. "So am I," he said. "Every morning that I wake up here, Ella, every one." The October night settled over them, over the homestead and the full cellar and the sleeping children and the 12-year-old peach trees, over the repaired fence and the good spring in the 8 new acres, and the preserving kitchen in the Linta with its rows of bright jars, over everything they had built in the 4 years, since a cowboy had seen a woman standing outside a bank in the morning light, and made a choice to ask if she was all right. The stars moved, as they always do, in their slow and indifferent arc across the Texas sky, and Ella and Roy Vaughn sat on the porch of their home and held each other's hands in the dark, and it was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything.